Welcome to the Fermynwoods Contemporary Art Podcast, guest curated and presented by Subterra. I am your host and one half of Subterra, Marie-Chantal Hamrock. We invite you to get lost in the unknown as we take a stroll through rich woodlands, dark forests, and subterrestrial landscapes. As we navigate these eerie and unfamiliar spaces, we will explore artist talks, discussions, and original commissioned sound art. Regular listeners will already be familiar with our theme of xylophobia, the fear of wooden objects or forests. Hanna Tuulikki's new audio essay, The Forest Will Answer in the Way You Call to It, encourages a conversation with the woods, exploring her Finnish heritage and weaving together family stories, folklore, and song. The piece reflects on how ideals of ecology, identity, and nationhood are constructed and entwined. The essay features audio extracts from her installation Under Forest Cover, commissioned for the 2021 Helsinki Biennial. Hanna Tuulikki is a British-Finnish artist, composer, and performer based in Scotland. Her multidisciplinary projects investigate the ways in which the body communicates beyond and before words to tell stories through imitation, vocalization, and gesture. With a largely place-responsive process, she considers how bodily relationships and folk histories are encoded within specific environments, ecologies, and places. Hanna often draws on embodied vernacular knowledges, in particular, practices of vocal and gestural mimesis of the more than human to offer alternative approaches to making kin, both with one another and across multi-species entanglements. Her most recent work engages with vital questions about what it means to live on a damaged planet, proposing contemporary queer ritual as a means to process the trauma that comes with ecological awareness. Perhaps, after listening, you will also feel inclined to call to the forest as Hanna does. If so, pay close attention to how it may answer you.
There's a Finnish saying, the forest will answer in the way you call to it. A lesson of cause and effect. It teaches that the things we do have consequences. Echoes bounce back. What goes around comes around. The sounds you can hear are those of archive recordings of Finnish cow-calling songs with wordless tones and lyrics that translate into English as come home, come back home. My mum, Vuokko, is Finnish. She was born in 1946 in northern Savo, a district in eastern Finland. As a child, she spent the summer months on her grandparents' farm in a village, just a few miles north of where she grew up. It was a typical small, family-run mixed farm with sheep, chickens, crops of rye, and a dairy herd supplying milk to local communities. By the time I was born in 1982, my mum was living in England, working as a translator. My great-grandparents had passed away, and the farm, then home to my mum's uncle and aunt, was dedicated to the small-scale production of strawberries and forestry. Our many trips to Finland when I was a child always made a huge impression on me. Perhaps it was partly to do with Mum's vivid storytelling of happy childhood memories. There was the story about her neighbours at home coming together to raise an orphaned bear cub in the children's playhouse. The image of Mum's favourite aunt, Mealy, on the farm, calling the cows home, the bells around their necks jingling through the forest. And the tale of how Mealy tried to teach Mum how to milk a cow by hand, as it was done back then, but all the milk ending up in her rubber boots. Then there was the story about the camera obscura. On the farm, there was an outhouse known as an aitta, a traditional building without windows used to store domestic materials, clothes, towels, and linens. Mum, along with her siblings and cousins, always insisted on sleeping there, away from the adults, making a den in the dark. The only light coming in when the sun was shining was through a large keyhole in the outer door, about 3 centimetres high and 1 centimetre wide. Mum's brother, Vesa, who was camera-obsessed, had recently read something in a magazine about how to make a DIY camera obscura. Using the keyhole as a lens and a large bedsheet as a screen, he fashioned an image of the outside world, a real-time film projection of what was going on in the yard, only upside down, with upturned people, cats, chickens and cows, all going about their business. Mesmerised, the kids spent hours watching this topsy-turvy world. Growing up bilingual in an English town, family stories like these felt precious to me, like fairy tales, each one a small glimpse into my Finnish heritage. This romanticism was only amplified by the excitement I felt as a child spending time in Finland, especially visiting the farm, which to me felt like a museum of strange and wonderful things. There was the exotic compost toilet housed in a wooden structure that you had to go outside to use, and the dusty accordions hanging in a row on the wall of the farmhouse, which I was told would have been played around the long wooden table in what was known as a pirtti, the main open-plan living area, filling the building with music. And then there was the dark forest encircling the farm, where on occasion I was allowed to go and pick bilberries that stained my little fingers bright purple, and where, it was said, wolves, bear, and lynx might be roaming. The imagination of my 6-year-old self was ignited. After my grandmother died in 1990, we began to visit Finland less frequently, and slowly as English school life and friendships took over, at some point I stopped speaking as much Finnish at home and my fluency diminished. In my adulthood, I felt a strange disconnect with my Finnish heritage, almost like I've narrowed the diversity of my identity into a strange monoculture. And so, over the years, I've sought out different ways to reconnect. The forest will answer in the way you've waited. In search of roots, we can easily become disorientated by romantic ideas. Finnish national identity is often discussed in relation to nature, especially forests, which are etched into people's consciousness as a kind of magical, spiritual and cultural wellspring. Yet the evolution of nationhood itself only really began as recently as the 19th century, when the Finnish cultural elite, in their push towards independence, sought to construct a unique Finnish identity, finding inspiration within mythical forest folklore. The publication of the national epic Kalevala, compiled by Elias Lönnrot from oral song poetry, was instrumental in the development of a whole nationalistic arts movement that eventually led to Finland's independence from Russia in 1917. Here's an example of Kalevala song poetry from Karelia, sung by Ivana Onoila in 1905. He sings the opening to a long mythical epic about the birth of the world, where the shaman demigod, Väinämöinen, is wounded and falls into the water. A small scorp duck, looking for a nesting place, happens upon him and makes a nest on his knee. The earth, sea, sky, and planets all come into being from the egg which it lays. Like tree roots, history disappears beneath the surface, into the past, and across borders. Elias Lönnrot was born in 1802 in Uusimaa, in southern Finland, which was then part of Sweden. While he was a child, Finland came under Russian rule after the War of 1809, though with some degree of autonomy. At 21, he entered the Imperial Academy of Turku, where, inspired by a burgeoning romantic nationalism, he focused on Finnish mythology, writing his thesis about an ancient pagan divinity. Putting his love of mythology to one side, he went on to study medicine, and at the tender age of 31, he landed a job as a district doctor in Kajaani in eastern Finland, which, incidentally, is just a few miles north of my family's farm. It was a time of great famine, where, after many years of crop failure, the rural communities around him were struggling to make ends meet. Perhaps this experience motivated him to return to his research into Finnish culture and to contribute to the nationalist independence movement, because it was around this time that he began to write about the ancient Finnish language and collect traditional song poetry from rural people. In total, he made 11 trips around Finland to gather material for his project that was to become the Kalevala, a national epic inspired by the likes of Ossian's Iliad. He rarely wrote down the name of the singer, except perhaps some of the more prolific ones, his primary focus being to catalogue the verses in order to build a narrative for his book. Where there were gaps, he filled them, adding his own lines to ensure the story was coherent. His invention stuck. The first edition, known as the Old Kalevala, was published in 1835, with an updated New Kalevala published 14 years later. The story of Kalevala is an epic tale about the creation of the earth, telling of the adventures and rivalries of heroes, shamans and witches, encounters with talking salmon, wolves and forest spirits, and a mysterious artifact called the Sampo, a magical object forged by a legendary blacksmith. After 20,000 verses or so, the poem ends with an apology. Perhaps the singer droned on too long, perhaps it was a wretched performance, but if so, this couldn't be helped, as he was never trained, but maybe someone else in the future will sing it better. Here's another example of Karelian Kalevala song poetry, sung by Anni Kirillov in 1922. She sings the tale of the birth of the kantele, a mythical musical instrument. The story begins with Väinämöinen, who hears a boat weeping. He asks the boat to tell him the reason for its sorrow. "I weep because I'm not floating on the waters," it replies. Väinämöinen pushes it down to the shore and it floats on the lake. He invites young maidens to fill one side of the boat and young men to fill the other, and he sits at the stern. The young folk row so strongly that the boat begins to sing like a swan, becoming fast on the back of a great pike. From this pike's jawbone, Väinämöinen forges a kantele, a 5-stringed, plucked zither, and plays it so beautifully that the goddess of the waters and the god of the forest come to hear him play. I've loved the Kalevala since I first encountered it in my late teens. It's mysterious, full of exquisite pagan poetry, forest animism, and multi-species entanglements. And in some ways it's helped me understand my heritage. But putting this aside, one of the most striking things to me is how most of the material that was woven into this national epic was gleaned from the borderlands of Karelia, the Kola Peninsula, and as far as Ingria and Estonia. Karelia in particular, which borders Finland and Russia, was where Lönnrot was most successful in his collecting of Kalevala song poetry, and by the end of the 19th century, Karelian heritage and its forest landscapes, being viewed as a refuge for the essence of Finnishness, had become a fashionable wellspring for writers, painters, poets and composers, all keen to contribute to the national project. But the desire of Finland's cultural elite to create one independent nation rooted in an ancient culture ultimately distorted history. It cultivated a kind of monoculture with artificial boundaries. But in the larger scheme of things, at least through their celebration of ancient forest culture, there's still respect for forests and more than human habitats, right? Finland is one of those green Nordic nations, isn't it? The forest will answer in the way you call to it. Nothing is ever as it seems. We like to think of Finnish forests as rich, diverse ecosystems or as mystical, untouched wildernesses. It's very easy to get this impression when Finland's landmass is covered in trees, but in reality, most Finnish forests are crop production landscapes exploited by industry. Around the world, traditional forestry practices tend to use sustainable, selective logging methods where only a small quantity of trees are removed at the same time, allowing for new growth. Yet, despite Finland's strong identification with ancient forest cultures, the Finnish model of forestry has evolved to centre around what is known as clear-cutting, meaning that all the trees in a particular area are felled at once, with new ones being planted in a grid formation to replace them. Consequently, there are very few ancient biodiverse forests left, with most being monoculture plantations. Of course, we're told that these plantations will help to mitigate climate change, and perhaps they would if left well alone, but the Finnish government plans to increase harvesting substantially, which will halve this green nation's carbon sink within the decade, inevitably affecting global carbon emissions. And so, as is often the case, capitalism overrode ecological sensitivity. After independence, famine became a thing of the past. Finland grew their modern economy using their forests, exporting timber and paper around the world. With their green gold hailed as an economic success story, Finnish forestry consultants and paper pulp companies exported their methods further afield. Over the past 50 years, these big corporations have caused large-scale devastation of natural forests by using the celebrated Finnish method of clear-cutting, creating huge greenhouse gas emissions from forests, forest soils and peatlands in Brazil and Indonesia. I find it such a shocking paradox that a nation that identifies so strongly as an ancient forest people have been so eager to export such obvious destruction to other parts of the world. The forest will answer in the way you call to it. Wherever we live in the world, there's increasingly a disconnect between what's encoded in various traditions and the reality of local ecologies threatened by climate breakdown. When we begin to engage with the sheer horror of the climate emergency and of biodiversity loss, it can be so overwhelming and bewildering. Perhaps it's easier to hold on to romantic ideas of magical forests and to look through rose-tinted lenses at idealised, picturesque landscapes. But in doing so, we can find ourselves trapped somewhere between myth and reality. It could be said we are caught in Metsänpeiton, meaning forest cover, a Finnish folkloric concept used to explain when people went missing or got lost in the forest. To be caught in forest cover means to be lost in an enchanted forest that has cast a spell on you. Once inside, it's difficult to find your way out. Familiar places become uncanny. You can hear strange sounds, and everything runs in reverse or turns upside down. You might become indistinguishable from a rock or a tree, and you cannot be heard or found. If you know how, there are certain actions you can perform that will release you from the forest cover, such as turning clothes inside out, beating the ground, looking under the left arm or between the legs. But others may never find their way out. We could begin to read these experiences of being caught in forest cover, the dissociation, the shifts in sensory awareness, and the change in perception of time, as experiences of trauma. In the current climate of socio-environmental monocultures and huge political upheavals, our values seem so topsy-turvy and back to front, I can't help but think perhaps humanity is caught in a massive forest cover. Will we ever find our way? The forest will answer in the way we wait. What might it mean to explore forest cover as a metaphor for the trauma and grief that comes with ecological awareness? And what might the folklore associated with it teach us about how we might begin to process these psychological aspects of ecological crisis? What does it mean to be caught in the cover of a monoculture forest plantation? How can we release ourselves from entrapments of idealized landscapes and over-romanticized nationalism? How can we think with tree, become with tree? How on earth do we come to terms with our reality? There's an old Finnish, Karelian, Ingrian custom associated with the forest of singing your troubles to the trees, one that didn't find its way into Kalevala. In this tradition, people would go to the forest and tell or sing their sorrows to the birch, spruce or willow. It was thought the forest would listen without judgment, never betraying the singer. The sounds you can hear are an Ingrian song performed in 1937 by Mari Vahta and chorus. The lyrics translate roughly as, "Though I cry and though I sing, no happiness arrives to lighten my days. If I sing, it is not out of joy. My mother never hears my weeping, nor does my father recognize my sorrow. If I tell one, they will tell another 9. When summer and berry picking time arrives, I go to the forest to pick them. There I cry to the spruce and the handsome birch. A few years ago, I was invited to make some work for Helsinki Biennial. For me, it was an opportunity to take time to reflect on how ideals of ecology, identity, and nationhood are constructed and entwined. Perhaps, I thought, I'll take my sorrow to the trees, tell my troubles to the birch. Reconnecting with my roots in a kind of pilgrimage, I visited my family's farm for the first time since I was a child. Now derelict, it sits on the top of a small hill surrounded by forest plantation of spruce, birch, pine and alder. In memory of my ancestors who once called the cows home, I recorded a vocal improvisation based on traditional cow calling songs, animating the echo of the surrounding forest plantation. Working with this recording back in the studio, I created a kind of sonic Metsänpeiton, or forest cover, composing across 5 speakers, manipulating the sound to play forwards, then backwards, slowing, glitching and stretching it, allowing the voice to emerge and disappear into a mist of interference. Inside this sonic world, I devised a choreography of held poses, compact round shapes corresponding to stones or tree stumps, 4-legged and 3-legged positions which blur the edges of human and other than human animals, and upright positions which speak to the verticality of trees and to the iconic figure of the Maiden of Finland, the national personification of the country. Other poses, like looking under the left arm or between the legs and beating the ground, reference the folkloric gestures and actions said to help the one lost in forest cover find their way out. Learning to hold each position for a minute or so, which was quite challenging, felt as though by staying inside these difficult shapes, there was a body equivalence to staying with difficult feelings or with discomfort, or to quote the great Donna Haraway, staying with the trouble. How do we stay with the trouble and see the wood for the trees? Learning to perform the movements backwards, I filmed the sequence 11 times, removing a piece of clothing before each cycle. And in the film edit, I reversed the whole thing, giving an unsettling Lynchian quality to the movement. Interlocking with the sound, I played with different speeds of playback, making quick edits between different takes, the effects being a kind of glitching between single searching disembodied limbs, cut with flashes of full human form, speaking to experiences of dissociation that often comes with trauma, and to the element in the folklore of becoming indistinguishable from the surroundings. The moving image and sound culminates in a song of sorrow for the trees, with English lyrics that engage with ecological grief, and, like the choreography, I learned to perform it backwards. I then reversed the recording, which does a strange thing to the quality of the song, distorting it almost like it's being sung from another dimension, from under forest cover, perhaps.
So I cry and so I sing, that I do not grow better. So I cry and so I sing, that I do not grow better. That I do not grow better, but my weeping never stops.
For the Biennial in Helsinki, the digital choreography and sound came together in an installation in an underground bunker on Vallisaari, an island in Helsinki's archipelago, inside a constructed grove of silver birch tree trunks reminiscent of a small area of forest plantation where the trees are all of a similar size. The moving image was projected onto a see-through screen, and so the body floats in the space like a hologram or spectral presence. Fractured by a grid of birch, this disembodied figure feels their way in the dark through glitches, dissociation and grief, while a bodiless voice searches perpetually under forest cover. Can we ever find our way? In the folklore, the way out of forest cover is not through thinking, but through feeling with the body, through shifting perspective. In my weird exploration of dark ecology, I suggest that before we can begin this process of feeling our way, we first have to recognize the deceptive appearance of forest cover. Perhaps, if we listen carefully, we will hear an echo through the trees.
When I sing, it's not for joy, but I will not cease my song. When I sing, it's not for joy, but I will not cease my song. That I do not grow better, but my singing never stops. I cried to the ones before, but I do not the trees I take my tears, calm my sorrows to the to the trees I take my tears, calm my sorrows to the through the forest is my song, but I will not grow better.
You can find more from Hanna at her website, hannatuulikki.org. Accompanying images for this episode are on our website. Listeners on Spotify are able to experience an accompanying video to this episode by artist Sapphire Goss. And for listeners on other platforms, you can find Sapphire's work on our website as well. Links to all of this are in the episode description, as always. Sapphire Goss is a multidisciplinary artist who works with moving image, photography, and other lens-based methods. Using obsolete technologies, she creates chimerical imagery using unexpected materials, looping and processing to make an analog uncanny. Grainy, shimmering, and otherworldly bursts of light and emotion that are both moving and mysterious. A wonderful accompaniment to this audio work. This episode has been edited by Astrid Björklund, the other half of Subterra. Thank you for listening to the Fermynwoods Contemporary Art Podcast. If you enjoy our podcast, make sure to positively rate, review, and subscribe on your podcatcher. It helps other people find the podcast, and it makes us feel good about ourselves. This podcast series is part of Xylophobia, Fermynwoods Contemporary Art's new 2-year programme funded by Arts Council England. Visit fermynwoods.org for more information on our programme and to sign up for our monthly email newsletter. Follow us at Fermynwoods on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and make sure to check out Subterra at Subterrestrials on Instagram. Thank you for listening. Hope to see you back here soon.